Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Professor Robert Paine of Memorial University in Newfoundland was born in England. He's been in Cambridge for the last 6 months at the Scott Polar Research Institute, writing a book on his early fieldwork among the Saami, the Lapps of North Norway. This work was done in the 1950s and early 60s, and since then he's had a very varied career, taking him to Scandinavia, Canada, and most recently Israel. Robert, you first became an anthropologist as a postgraduate in Oxford, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us how that came about?
Well, I mean, it's a century and a half ago, but I read modern history, and towards the end of that 3 years, I remember quite distinctly, actually, the afternoon where a friend and myself thought, what's it going to be? And we thought in terms of colonial service, district officer stuff, and so we opened the calendar, the Oxford University calendar, and the page fell open, well, after a bit of juggling perhaps, at social anthropology. Mm-hmm. And it looked at an extremely exciting curriculum. So I went off to the institute and I met somebody who I later realized was Evans Pritchard, and he said roughly, he said very gently and briefly, read The Irish Countryman, and if you get a 2-1 you can come for the diploma.
That was Arensberg's book.
Yeah. Yeah. Which was a delight to read that summer, and I managed to get the 2-1, so I took the diploma. That was, I think, in 1951.
Who was around in the institute at that time?
Oh, well, the institute then, it was the year after, roughly, that Mayor Fortis and Max Gluckman left respectively for Cambridge and Manchester, but there was everybody else, minus we the Tikopia and Aishapira. It was a remarkable place. There was Srinivas, there was Steiner, there was the Bohannons, there was Prestiani, Dumont, and we saw a lot of these people. The person who I remember, I think, with the greatest thrill for her contributions at the seminar and post-seminar was Laura Bohannon. We used to call her Dusty Bohannon, Jim Bohannon's wife. But I had tutorials from Dumont and Srinivas and Prestiani, when Prestiani wasn't down at the antique shop or filling in his tax returns or something.
And so how did that get you to Lapland?
Oh, well, for some reason I wanted to go to the Eskimos, and I think it's just a purely romantic reason, and it's all very hazy for me now. But I really did fancy myself sort of, behind the sled team with the dogs and igloos, and it was Steiner who sort of adopted me there at the institute. And he said, right, well, it's difficult because, there's all this easy money for New Guinea, but it's awfully difficult to get to the Eskimos, and it's very expensive too. And incidentally, said Franz Steiner, I do need some data for a book that I'm doing on the Karelians up there in the northern Scandinavia. How about you going up there for the summer and coming back, and perhaps you write a billet? Well, that's what I did. My grandmother, my maternal granny, left me £50 in her will, and I went to Grimsby and got a trawler. This is all sounding terribly heroic, but it's roughly as it happened. It's all a sort of giant accident, because as I say, I elected to go to a non-prestige area, and there was no funding really. So I was up there in North Norway, and I didn't go to the trawler took me to Tromsø, this town in North Norway, and I didn't go to Karelia, but I think I squared that with Steiner actually, and I attempted to get to these reindeer nomads, these Saami, the Lapps, and I didn't succeed at all in the first try. This was the summer of '51, and I landed up in a summer camp where there was just women and children and old men, and they bodily threw me out, and I walked to the coast, and I stayed on the coast for 2 years, and I took my BSc, which is the same thing as a B.Lit. I don't quite know the difference, but anyway, it was the alternative graduate degree, and my DPhil on these coastal people.
Who were also Saami.
Oh, Saami indeed. But they wouldn't, and they spoke Saami in the village as well as Norwegian, but they would not teach me Saami. They had, Saami was a stigmatized identity for them at that time. I've been back since, and it's not so much now. So the adventure with the nomads had to wait another day.
So would you call that a happy time among the coastals, Saami?
Why, it wouldn't be quite the word I would describe it by, but it was an enormous adventure. I mean, I was out there, very self-consciously, the anthropologist, and I was thinking, well, what would EP think of me, and am I else, it was a terrific time. I went very native in as much as that I didn't bother going back to Oxford and stayed around there and got to know the people, lived with them. The Germans had evacuated North Norway with scorched earth policy, and so they were rebuilding the place physically. So I put myself on the labour market slightly below the current rates, which was meant that I could simply choose what work and who I would work for. So I was quite self-sufficient without grants, and in fact I've told the few students who've passed through my hands from time to time that do not flaunt your grant, and don't allow your grant to say that you don't need a sleeping bag. In fact, ideally, pretend you haven't got a sleeping bag too. So what happened to me is that I really did. I became a sort of tramp or something in those villages, and I'd go along and I'd work for somebody, and they'd put me up.
What kind of work was that?
Well, as I say, it was rebuilding Finnmark.
Building site work.
It was mixing cement, building houses, and then it was also they burnt peat. So we went out and they used to talk about sticking the turf. We'd go out and dig the turf, stick the turf, and then there were the hay fields. And then in the winter, which wasn't much fun, I admit, it was fishing very early in the morning, going out to the cod nets in the fjord, because they're spawning cod up there. So that went on for about, I think, better part of a year and a half.
It's an unusual way of doing fieldwork, really, being an employee of the people you're studying.
Yeah.
One which you carried over into the reindeer Saami later on.
Well, yes, I hadn't, this is what I wanted. And the coast served the purpose of providing me with the data for these two theses. But I wasn't really over-thrilled by that. So I took off, and it was the Christmas week, I suppose, of '53, and got myself into the tundra to a village about 200 miles in, and had earned a little money down on the coast, and took that up with me in a post office savings book. And I became a sort of language student of an old geezer there, who always had plugged tobacco in his mouth. So I learned that was speaking like this, and it was quite crazy. But there is this guest relationship between nomad and sedentary, right, which is fairly general, I think, amongst pastoralists. And in comes the nomad to this person who I'm living with, this old man. And he says, damn it, I've lost my herdsboy to the Danes. They've taken him, they're paying him a pot of gold to work with reindeer in Greenland. Well, you can see what happened. He took me. So I hid my post office savings book, and I worked for him for 11 months. And that's where I learnt Saami. Nothing very much went into the notebook at that time, but obviously it was tremendously rewarding when I returned later. And that would be about 2 years later, I think, because I'd gone back to Oxford then to write the PhD, the DPhil, on the coast people. And then when I went back to do the reindeer people, right after this interval, I went back in a far more orthodox sort of way. I went back as a paying guest, and I could choose whoever I cared to be with. And the thing about about pastoralism is, and this has been said many times before, I would imagine, that you have to, as a fieldworker, have a certain mobility, because if you get stuck with one lot, you only see this one little picture, which is okay, but if you can come back and back and back, but if you're going to do the whole thing within the course of 2 years, you've got to have that mobility, which means you can't be employed any longer. You've got to be a paying guest. So I could go wherever I wanted. and just pay for my food.
And so you developed from that a picture of a whole host of migratory groups moving across a wide landscape. And
Yeah.
therefore your picture of their encounters and cross-cutting interests.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
so on.
yeah.
So how would you characterize the situation of the nomads, or the functioning of?
Okay, well, this is
the whole
62,
system?
right?
Mm.
And as we may get to this later, I've gone back all the time. So I mean, I was back in '83, so I've seen 2 generations of them. But in '62, it was that they were very self-consciously very different from anybody else on God's earth. They were very aristocratic in their behavior when they came into the village, running to the arrogant. They had the meat, they had the skins that the peasants wanted. They also had a lot of money because it was a very good market. The peasants, of course, had things like they had the milk products, and I think there was there was a certain amount of sexual attraction, nomad to sedentary, which brought the young nomads down to the villages a bit. The Norwegian administration of the nomads was, well, I can't say utterly ineffective, but it was not effective, which left the matters of jurisprudence in the hands of the nomads, which was thoroughly misunderstood by the Norwegians. The way the nomads would control each other would be by sending as I see it, by sending messages to each other in the form of actions taken against the other man's reindeer. And this is over a whole register. So if you really wanted to move him off the territory that you wanted, in rather an aggressive act, you would hamstring his animals, and you would not stop short of hamstringing the most valuable animals either, namely the cows and the male the oxen that have been trained for pulling sleds. But if you just simply wanted to give the fellow a gentle tap, a warning, that he's not behaving properly, then you would design an act appropriately, of a lesser magnitude. This was all glossed by the Norwegians as reindeer stealing, and I got very interested in that. So I would go to the courts, where these nomads, who quite often could speak Norwegian, would insist that they couldn't, and then you'd get the interpreter, and then the nomad who was in the box, in the dock, would then start correcting the interpreter, and then each side, because there would be 2 sides to the story, would each pack the court with their witnesses, and then they would overwhelm, in the third final phase of a law case, overwhelm the Norwegian magistrate and the jury could be a baker, candlestick maker who didn't have a word of Saami, with all the technicalities of reindeer marks. And then we'd go back to the camp, and we'd really enjoy recreating, at the expense of all the Norwegians, this law court. But I thought there was something quite serious happening, nevertheless, in fact very serious, amongst the Saami themselves about this. And it's this idea of that those acts of aggression were in fact messages, and they were very nicely, elegantly designed to fit the situation.
Which was also a situation, presumably, of very much of equals and rivals.
Yes, this is it, absolutely. It's equality and therefore rivals. And they love rivalry. And so you pull big men down, and the ideal situation is where you are equal enough to be rivals. Mm-hmm. And then you're playing with three basic assets or factors. I suppose it's called factors of production or something. But I mean, you've got to have a group, personnel, and then you've got to have the pasture, and then of course the animals, and these have to be in commensurate proportions. I mean, obviously, right?
Yes.
So
the time span of a big man was brief, presumably.
Yeah, what happened was that he would accumulate and this is where Norwegian ethnographers have really gone astray, because they will give you a lot of quantitative data computed on that this man has got 500, so many have got 500 reindeer, and this is the average size. Those people who've got 500 reindeer, what we want to know is when they have the 500 reindeer, and we'll find, for example, that they have 500 reindeer the year before they start marrying off their daughters. 5 years later they haven't, they've only got 200, but they've set up 3 daughters.
Yes.
So the anticipatory inheritance is one factor that works for a very early curve, a graph, with regard to reindeer wealth. And the other factor is this equalizing thing, that if you get too big, and not just too big for your boots, but too big to look after your animals and to be out there, then people take them from you.
So if you have that many animals, presumably you need dependents.
Yes. Yes.
Or hired herds.
Yes. And there is perfectly okay sort of symbiotic relations, because if I'm just starting up, it's great for me to be with a big man, and it may look to the outside observer that I'm working for him, but in fact it means that I, for example, in my animals do not have to set aside any bulls, because my cows can be serviced by his bulls. And furthermore, if he really is a big man, with my help together and others, we may master a good pasture. But after a while I'll break away, and I may take his daughter with me.
Yes. So it's a collective herding with individual ownership.
Yeah, and hence the tragedy of the commons, because it's collective herding, nobody has responsibility for it, and everybody is to maximize their own herd, so the pastures become overgrazed. I've talked with Keith Harth about this, and he doesn't like that way, because he gives me the history of the tragedy of the commons, which is something to do with, I don't know, some sort of capitalist plot. And okay, but the other side to this is true, which Keith pointed out to me, that of course the pastoralists are having their pastures taken away from them by hydroelectric development, by military maneuver grounds and so forth. But again, to subtract all that, this arrangement of collective rights to pasture and individual rights to property is a fatal formula for looking after the commons, I would have thought.
And the fact that the looseness of the the looseness of the herds presumably corresponds to a loose social organisation.
Yeah.
And does this all together conspire to make them weak at representing themselves to the authorities?
Interesting, very interesting question, and I would say definitely in the 60s, but now in the 80s, not. For we now have to introduce another variable, and that is the power of ethnicity. They've got a terrific symbol going. I mean, the Saami people, actually it's only one, it's a political party of the Saami people, because there are Saami who say this is nonsense and we want to be as close as possible to the Norwegians. But given the Saami nationalists, they use the reindeer and the pastures as their symbol of Saaminess par excellence, and this has won them a great deal politically.
A symbol which the coastal ones can't share.
The coastal ones can't share, and this is a very serious matter now for ethnopolitics there. And the Saami intellectuals have been very slow to recruit a constituency from the coast, from the Saami, because where most of the Saami, if you count heads, are or maybe were, because they have been casting off that identity. So I mean, the nomads are, I forget the figure now, but I mean it's they are, say, only one in 10 or something of Saami.
But the annual migration takes them down to the coast.
Oh yes, indeed.
What kind of encounter do they have there with the coastal Saami?
Well, the sort of thing you'd like would, of course, would be. I saw this first of all from that coastline village that I was in, right? The fishing village in the fjord. Oh God, here they come! Here comes witchcraft and sorcery, you know. And so any sort of illness and untoward happening in the village would be attributed to these Saami, who they didn't call Saami. They used the term fjellfinn, which is a piece of nasty Norwegian, right? Otherwise, the coastal population have got really a very strong case here, because the Saami are coming in using their pastures. That the reindeer Saami are coming in using their pastures, because out on the coast you have sheep and you have cows and you have extensive agriculture on the Finnish scale, and it's all outfield.
During the years you were in Norway, you were very closely associated with Frederick Barr.
Ah, Frederick. Yes, indeed. Because he was in the States and then in LSE and then in Cambridge, and he came home. And we're now, I think, around the period 1960-65. And he set up shop in Bergen. The background to that is somewhat discrediting to Norwegian ethnography. They didn't find a place for him in Oslo University. And he collected around himself a small band of brothers, and I was one of them. There were about three of us to begin with, and then I think we came to about 6, and then we had the first MA students. Remarkable man, tremendously gifted in imparting to one a sense of importance and a thrill. Not in the least pompous, but he managed to make everything exciting and significant. And he got us to work. He was actually the youngest of us, of this band. We were all born between 1924 and 1930, and Frederick was 1920. He was 19. We were born between 24 and 28, and Frederick was born in 1928.
And his seminars attracted quite a lot of visitors from mainstream places abroad.
Well, I'm not sure about...
Was that something... How did he manage to build that up?
Well, I'm not sure quite that it attracted, because, I mean, Bergen was still not quite on the map yet, and Frederick was very welcome to go anywhere himself. But what happened was that, I mean, sure, there were a few Fulbright scholars that came. We used to call them half-brights, incidentally. But what Frederick did was he used his capital that he'd accrued in the UK. So we had, in turn, Edmund Leach, Max Gluckman, and Raymond Firth and Rosemary Firth for a week at a time in Bergen, and we all used to give our little seminar papers. And Edmund Leach, I remember once, I haven't had anything like this since Malinowski's seminar. And this was this incredible man, Frederick. It didn't last long, and but that's his story. But Bergen was really quite an incredible place for half a dozen years, and I think those of us who were there, they'll say that 6 of us, we all recognise this, and each in his own way or her own way has been helped by it. And when I left Bergen to go to Canada, I did so with confidence. I knew I had a pedigree, and it wasn't Oxford, it was Bergen.
And so what about one of these sort of strongest catchphrases or words to come out of that period was transactionalism.
Yeah. Mm.
Did you find that arose very comfortably out of your own fieldwork anyway?
Yes.
Or was that more from the influence of Frederick himself?
Well, the answer to this is actually, on the one hand, on the other hand sort of answer, because quite genuinely, I was giving lectures in Bergen on these reindeer people, and I don't think I used the word transaction, but it was that's exactly what was going on. But then when Frederick wrote the models, or gave the models at LSE, wasn't it? They end up as an occasional paper, right? Well, he discussed them with us in Bergen, and it was clearly that here I had the language in which I could more elegantly, put my fumblings, translate my fumblings into this language. Sure.
Though you later disagreed with him.
Well, disagreed, not really, no. I mean, I felt that I knew Frederick's anthropology rather well. I felt, in fact, that I knew it better than those who were sort of paying these incredible sort of floral tributes to him in order to get published, perhaps. That's how I felt in Man and American Anthropologist. And it was just becoming a lazy shibboleth. It was, transaction, hurrah. And so I thought that, well, why not? I'll write an essay, and it ended up as an occasional paper. And I suppose for a time, It was sort of, all right, read Barth and then read the occasional paper by Paine. But really, the burden of that paper was that the paradox is that Frederick has neglected power. But don't ask me too much about that, because it is a long time ago that I wrote that blessed thing. But it was to take transactionalism seriously than the prophet himself. It's the old story, right? So the disciple or the next generation, intellectually speaking, takes out some of the bugs and puts in new twists. Frederick didn't in any way say thank you to that. And in fact, in those collected papers that he has from Routledge Keegan, which in turn I reviewed in Man, I thought he was singularly, I could say ungenerous, but let's say unimaginative in his reply to his critics. There were three of us. There's Talazard and the American at Chapel Hill, Evans, E-V-E-N-S. However, but
did he not take kindly to criticism generally, do you think?
I wouldn't want to, it's never occurred to me to think about that, and I wouldn't really want to comment. The thing about Frederick's is that he puts artistry into his anthropology. He doesn't, and he believes in his brilliance, and you can see this in his writing. It is not very well buttressed by references, and he may piggyback a little bit on other people without realizing it. I'm not referring to myself, I'm referring to, he may piggyback on seminal papers without perhaps recognizing it. But he is so quick off the mark and so seminal in sense of picking up a possibility and quickly making it accessible to his peers, that really I don't think we have much. I think it would be misleading to discuss whether or not he took to criticism kindly or not.
So how did you come to move to Canada?
Oh well,
Must have been quite a.
and it wasn't Canada either. It was at that time Newfoundland, which actually is Newfoundland. Well, the Scandinavian system is that they occasionally advertise the senior posts, professor and docent, which docent is roughly associate professor. And then everybody enters into the competition, and it's pretty predictable who's going to enter because of there are only a few posts, and so the whole of the peer group sort of enters. And then you're given, I think, 2 months or 3 months to polish, to finish the manuscripts. In fact, you hadn't even begun, to submit for this competition, and competition is the word. Well, my colleagues, these band of brothers that I was talking about, I was a little senior to them in traditional terms. Well, I'd got an Oxford DPhil, and nobody in Norway was taking PhDs. And one way or another, I was sort of, anyway, they said, okay, Robert, now we've got to start something up in Oslo, because Oslo was lagging behind, and there was a docent advertised. So I went into the competition, and Oslo said, right, would you like to be the docent? In other words, I came out number 1 in this list. And I thought, Christ, I can't do this. I could look after myself in Norwegian, but to look after a department, go into a faculty meeting, and keep your end up for your discipline, bargaining with native speakers, in other disciplines. And precisely at that time, when I was having cold feet, and I hadn't told anybody that I had cold feet, I got this letter from a fellow who's now my absolute bosom pal, and this bibliophile that I was talking about at lunch, who was on a sabbatical at Oriel, Oxford, and was wandering in quite often to listen to seminars in Keble Road at the Institute of Social Anthropology. He's in English literature. And this letter came out of the blue. Would you please come? Our department's collapsed and we have an institute. So I said I'd go for 6 months. Well, within 6 hours I knew this is where I should be. It was so much easier, and I was ready for sort of being on the frontier myself, being sort of. It was so much easier because of the language. Also, there was this incredible area at the hinterland, the anthropological hinterland, the whole of this Canadian Arctic, Labrador, Newfoundland itself. And actually very soon we saw it was the North Atlantic all the way from Labrador to Norway with intervening posts such as Iceland, Scotland, Hebrides, Shetland. And the money. I mean, just the money for research. So we got very soon, I convinced the dean that he trusted me, and I convinced him that we should have, I said, we won't build a team in competition against McGill or Toronto. How could we? They're much better known places. There's only one way you can do it, is offer joint appointments. Mm-hmm. He went along with that, and within 12 months we'd got Milton Freeman and Jean Briggs and others.
By this you mean joint between research?
We said, Jean, you come, I understand that McGill wants you. Look, you really, your heart and soul is in the Arctic, and if you come to St. John's, you'll teach for a term and you can have a term off, or teach for a year and have a year off. And how could she have a year off from teaching? Because we had an institute, Institute of Social and Economic Research. And at that time I think there was only one other in Canada. St. John's Memorial University in many ways it's been a very unexpected and remarkable place, not across the board but in a handful of disciplines, and my predecessors there, including Ian Whittaker, he was one of them, invented this institute. So we could afford to do it.
And so you were, once again in a way, you arrived at a good moment.
Yes, lucky Jim.
Presumably
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been possible at other times.
Well, no, I suppose not.
And how did you decide there? I mean, that was a period of area specialization institutes generally, wasn't it? How did you decide to expand or limit your area of operation?
Well, it presented itself, didn't it? I mean, in this North Atlantic area that I mentioned, we actually, so we wouldn't be mistaken for a certain treaty organization, we called it very carefully the Northern North Atlantic, but that's long since sort of gone by the way. But there was no, I mean, University of Aberdeen, no, they weren't interested in that. University of Edinburgh, no, they were in Sierra Leone. University of Bergen, they were amongst the Darfur, Sudan. McGill, they were in the Caribbean. I mean, it was there. And it was a beautiful field because it allowed one to have Jean Briggs and other Arctic specialists, Inuit specialists, and people like Elliot Layton over in Ireland, and myself in Norway. And it was all fair play, it was all kosher, because it was all the two littorals of this North Atlantic.
But the initial pressure was to confine yourself to Labrador and Newfoundland.
Well, the mandate of the Institute was such, but it was sort of comparative studies such will pour light upon the past, present and future of Newfoundland will be permitted. So that was all right. But I tried to tell them, we had to go to the Caribbean. Why do you have to go to the Caribbean, Paine? Well, I mean, Newfoundland is a renewable source, it won't go on forever, we'll run out of Newfoundland. Well, they didn't really believe this, but at that time, politically, I was running strong, so we were allowed to go to the Caribbean. I remember we even wrote into the annual report that the Institute now is in the Caribbean. So we sent off 2 MA students, women, and neither came back. So it was immediately taken out again. So Caribbean is not within our mandate.
And a large part of your work there, as well as building up the Institute, was to embark on or build up a program of publications.
Yeah.
And projects and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, the first big fruit of that was Patrons and Brokers.
Well, that's from the Patrons Brokers is the first of a series of which we call, because somebody told us to call it, colloquia, and there's a series of those books, right? But the beginning of this story is not. It's something that I inherited. There was the first batch of pre-PhDs. Remember, what we're dealing with here is a small university department with an institute attached, not a doctoral program. And I all the time opposed the idea of a doctoral program. I didn't want to have to recruit people to teach the doctoral students and then have to the library. I thought much better off having the institute. So we had other people's doctoral students. And the legacy that I walked into was Jim Farris, University of Cambridge, right? PhD thesis, Cat Harbour. John Sved, who now is quite a bloke in Afro-American studies, his PhD thesis. And we just Xeroxed them, and that was in 66. And by 71 we decided we'd go for books, and we went to University of Toronto Press and used them as our printers. Mistake number one, because they'd get nice reviews, and the review editor would say would write down the book, note the book as a University of Toronto Press book. So we departed company with the U of T and started on our own, and that was at the time when the technology was coming in, even to all campuses, to make this possible. And then the other thing about this was, well, hey, let's have a series of colloquia, and on these colloquia they became rather they had a certain momentum from their initial success, and so colleagues would ask us to do them, and also they started approaching us to publish. This is all terribly boastful, all this. They asked us to publish the proceedings of their conferences, and that's been our niche, the so-called ISA books.
At the same time, or shortly afterwards, you got this Killam program for the Identity and Modernity project.
Yes.
Which was a very big milestone, presumably, in building up the institute.
Yes. But you see, it follows. It wasn't. It was okay. We've now got a team. We've got absolutely first-class people. This fellow Milton Freeman, who was in biology at UCL, and then came very close to Mary Douglas and moved from biology to anthropology. And he had joined us, and Jean Briggs I'd mentioned, and there are others. And this team meant I simply sort of put it together as a sort of editor, impresario or something.
Yeah.
And then we had a new generation of graduate students, including, for example, in the UK, David Riches, who's now up at St Andrews. And the theme there was, with the White Arctic is a deliberate double entendre, of course. It is that we felt our job was to look at the whites in the Arctic, and so we had essays on the clergy, on the missionaries, the doctors, the nurses, the RCMP, etc.
In fact, there's a lot to say. So what was the White Arctic really about?
Well, colonialism. Also, we felt that there was definite colonialism, and I mean, if we can take that as the definition is given, in the Arctic, but we felt it was a very undemonstrable colonialism. It was a difficult one to sort of provide chapter and verse for, because it was covered with welfare. It was welfare colonialism, and so the first task was to demonstrate this non-demonstrative colonialism. And then, I suppose, as one is wont in academia, we found somebody to hang a lot of stupidity upon, and that was John Honigman, who seemed to be saying in his two books that that the white man was good. The white man came and enlightened the Inuit and took him by the hand into the modern world, and without him, without the white man, without this helping hand, the Inuit would be lost. That really was I think that was really the main thrust of it. That was the editorial thrust, but I was very careful not to give any sort of brief to my research, to the researchers that were out there. But they actually, each in their own way, made this point. Plus another one that I hadn't really seen, which was how bloody neurotic those whites are, cooped up in these little towns and villages and settlements. And so we had a lot on an old thing for me, an old chestnut for me, on gossip amongst these white settlements. And so we coined the phrase the nursery game, to try and depict this in terms that would catch the attention of the civil service in Ottawa, for one thing. I mean, clearly our colleagues in Canada, I mean, there were a few dozen that were interested, they knew about the white Arctic, but it was, how do we get the civil servants, and the school teachers and the whites in the Arctic to know about this, if only to needle them, but of course, hopefully that they'd be concerned. And do you remember this book about the British nanny and Winston Churchill's nanny and Lord Curzon's nanny? I think the man's name was Gathorne Hardy. Well, he gave me the idea. So what I did, I simply applied this, rewrote this ethnography in the first issue of a new journal, Inuit Studies, in terms of nanny and child. And as I recall it now, it was that the Inuit was doomed like the sort of flying, or the white man was doomed like the Flying Dutchman who could never get off the ship. The white man could never stop being the nanny. But wasn't it too bad? That was roughly the... So that was the sort of... alongside the white Arctic, there was this satire.
So the Inuit, by that image, are never going to grow up?
Yeah, well, yes, because they're not allowed to.
Mm. At the same time, or shortly after that, I mean, this is already getting rather political, in the sense of being interested in politics.
Mm.
You then started getting interested in the rhetoric and careers of certain local politicians.
Yeah, not just
What
certain
came out of
politicians.
that?
I mean, there was this phenomenal man with a rather a letdown of a name, Mr. Joseph Smallwood, but he comes, there's a village of Smallwood in Cheshire actually, just Tony Cohen of Manchester showed me the other day, and I was up visiting him. No, Smallwood brought this Newfoundland, this Britain's oldest colony, into Canada as a province, and he ruled the roost, turning it rather into a banana republic actually in doing so, for a generation, I mean fully 25 years or something, and he was quite remarkable. I thought.
Which years are these?
Well, it's from All Fool's Day 1949, and so it'd be to 1972. And I was living on the island. I was in his bailiwick, and somebody said to me, well, I mean, don't you anthropologists ever see what's right in front of your nose? So I started on him. And then there was this election, which wasn't, I still have yet to polish off Mr. Smallwood properly, but there are some odd articles around. But the thing that sort of made it a little bit more was a quick book that I wrote called Ayatollahs and Turkey Trots. And again, my public was not my colleagues. It was definitely the Newfoundland public and the political public of Canada, and it was a bit of a sense, sort of a 24-hour sensation, the book in Canada. It was sort of frontline, I mean, for the book section of the national newspapers, you know, sort of splash around. And I mean, the title was, you know, I was training my cloak there, I mean, deliberately, but Ayatollahs and Turkey Trots. The election, it was about an election in Newfoundland, and the opponents were the ex-Foreign Secretary of Canada, who's a Newfoundlander, who fell with Trudeau. And he came and he thought it was a walkover. He thought it was a shoo-in. He was the Liberal, and he was called the Ayatollah, right? Because we were in the Khomeini days, and it was before any nasty things happened with the American captives. Mm-hmm. And he dug up, in reply, our Ayatollah dug up some Newfoundland folklore for his rhetoric and talked about turkey trots. And turkey trots, unknown, turkey trots are one step forward, two steps back. That's a turkey trot. And I remember in our department that summer, Podgy from Edinburgh was over teaching summer. He's a delightful fellow. He comes over quite often. He's got friends in the sociology department there. And he was thrilled. He's a very serious political sociologist, you know, it's real macro stuff. And he saw this title and he thought I was writing about Khomeini, you know, in bed with the Turkish Trotskyites. However, I thought that was very funny. So this was the beginning of this rhetoric thing. And then I took it to Harlow, which is our campus down in just south of Cambridge, where Memorial has a campus. And we had our first part of the colloquium out of which came the book Politically Speaking. Mm-hmm. And there we were very serious. For example, I forget his name now, but the reader of Political Science at Glasgow, he gave us a very good paper on analysing Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. Sandra Warman gave us the rhetoric of Black English. Frank Manning on Barbadians and so forth. And all this, you see, was done now quite legitimately, with no longer any surprise, under the umbrella of the Institute of Memorial.
Very interesting. And so all this was taking you all the time towards advocacy in general?
Well, yeah, sort of.
Which... Oh, well then let's look at what point were you asked by the Saami to return there and work on the question of their dam problem?
It was when their case went to the Supreme Court, and officially it was the Supreme Court of Norway that asked me, and it would be 82 or 1982, 83. And I find it very, very difficult, that brief, because it was a question, all right, you tell the truth, obviously, there was no question of mine, I wasn't going to tell any lies, but I wasn't going to tell the whole truth, and what sort of truth is that? But I felt that that the opponents of the Saami were not telling the whole truth. And I felt that since I was being commissioned by, my brief would be read and cross-examined by lawyers, that I could tell the truth of the case as I perceived it. Although as an anthropologist, and perhaps even as a citizen, I knew that there was another side, and I was suppressing it a bit. But then there's nothing in that brief that it is palpably untrue, but it is biased. But I reckon that I don't know how you see this, but I saw it as that's perfectly all right when you are in fact in this legal situation. And it's up to your opponent, the legal opponent, to find out that you're not giving the whole story. It didn't make any difference anyway, because we lost completely.
Perhaps you could give a bit of the background of this.
Oh, well, there's the ancestral home of the Saami, say the nationalists, who call themselves the Fourth Worlders. And through this ancestral home runs this magnificent river, the Alta Kautokeino River. The Duke of Westminster used to lease some of it for salmon fishing. There was a plan afoot to build a dam. The dam actually has now been built. Why this dam? Oh, because they have lots of dams in the south, and in North Norway we should have our dams too. And you see how I'm giving you part of the truth, not the whole truth, I suppose. And it was Labour Party politics. And Labour Party has always been very dishonest with regard to their constituents that are ethnic minorities, namely the Saami and the Finns. So it wasn't very difficult for an anthropologist, because there were two young Norwegians too involved at the lower level of court, of the procedure, at the magistrates' court level. They gave testimony for us to say yes, we will in fact make the case for these are ancestral lands. What I guess perhaps made my case weaker vis-a-vis the Supreme Court, but many a Saami has thanked me for it. As I said, the issue is not actually for these national Saamis whether or not the dam will be built. It is who's going to get the royalties from the dam, and who is going to say it'll be built or not. And it is quite so in that order. I mean, who's going to say it's going to be built or not? And if the Saami say it's going to be built, then they want the royalties. They want control of it. Well, in saying that, I guess I sort of muddied the waters, because it was vis-a-vis the Supreme Court. It made it easier for them to say, well, in fact, the reindeer Saami don't have a case, because apparently, according to this anthropologist, it's quite conceivable that they themselves would like a dam if they could be rich off it.
And the dam was intended to supply hydroelectric power to
I
that
don't know.
region.
I mean, there are all sorts of stories that The facts of the case now, as I understand them, is that in fact there's they're not really, there's an excess of power, electrical power. But the political excuse for this is that they were going to sell it to the Swedes.
We've heard that sort of story elsewhere. But this was eventually published by the IWGIA.
Yeah, by Helga Kleband's outfit in Copenhagen.
And what was published, is that a very close
Yes.
version of the document you submitted?
Yes, except I added a introduction for people who had never heard of Saami.
Right. And this, of course, takes us into the whole idea of the fourth world, which is really where all your working life has been. What sort of connections, similarities do you see between the Saami as fourth world people and the sort of people you were dealing with in North America?
Oh, lots of them, very similar. First of all, they travel a lot, these fourth worlders. Well, what is a fourth worlder? It's I like to say to my anthropological colleagues who sort of feel this is all rather sort of vulgar and fanciful and romantic, that in fact it's an emic term, but as you said to me yesterday when we were sort of discussing what we might be talking about, well, it's an emic term built on an etic to barbarize the language. I mean, it's because the annalists talk about the third world. The fourth world actually was uttered, the phrase was uttered in a conversation in a cocktail party in Ottawa between Nyerere of Tanzania and the then president of the Indian Brotherhood of Canada, George Manuels. George Manuels listened to Nyerere, and then Nyerere said, "What do you do?" And he explained that he was president of the Red Indians of Canada. He said, "Oh, well, fourth world." They travel a lot, these fourth worlders, and I've travelled with them. I mean, I've seen them in Australia and I've seen them in Canada. And these last two ISA books, with Noel Dick and Gerald Gold as editors, takes that journey. I mean, we have essays from Australia, Canada, and Saami and Norway. The other thing is, of course, that they are inevitably but a minority of their own people, and they're regarded with disdain and perhaps disgust by a lot of their own people. But that is inevitable, isn't it? Because they're the visionaries. They're saying today has got to be obliterated. We refuse to accept the general setup today. Well, a lot of people, of course, make the best of today, and so to get back to the Saami, there is now an opposing ideology, which is written out in a constitution. It is an association, a society with a constitution, and the first article of the constitution is we believe in the king, the parliament, and the church.
So offering to take themselves. Choosing to take themselves down the path which the Honigmans were offering the Inuit.
Yeah. Sure. What they've told me is this: that it's an insult to our self-esteem, to our self-respect, to think that we because most of these villages are Saami and non-Saami, the Saami and Finns and Saami Finns and Norwegians, that we should have special conditions, right? That the land is ours and not our neighbours. That we will have a special helping hand in school or whatever. And I'm afraid that I think we're very slow to see this. We see it all right in anthropology. We're very slow to admit this as a valid point. In other words, the fourth world is pretty bloody shrill. It's very, very necessary, but it is not the morally the final word at all. Things have got to be worked out, and they've got to be worked out amongst the people from whom these professional fourth worlders come from. But there aren't many anthropologists, I'm afraid, that I know of, who really are prepared to do the ethnography, for example, of the people who say king, parliament, and church. And this is one of the little tasks that I've set myself in the paper that's going to be published in Anthropologica. I've set out what they told me.
perhaps one reason they're reluctant is that this might undermine their own role as advocates.
Yeah, advocacy is, I think, yeah, it will confuse. Advocacy is a very difficult thing to do because, how can you? The first what we found in these papers we just put together in a book called Advocacy and Anthropology, the first thing was, how in the hell can you marry a dispassionate science, right, with something called advocacy? And so one is a bit shy about it, and then I think what we do is to say, well, I owe these particular people a debt because they gave me my PhD material, right? And I have seen with my own eyes how they are patronized and disparaged by, the people around them, whoever it may be. And that's quite an easy position for us to take. But I'm sure that advocacy is a good deal more than that. And I hope that some of the chapters in that advocacy and anthropology, particularly Peter Harris Jones, help us to see this. Oh, also actually Basil Sanson. He wrote a very nice piece for that.
But of course the new generation of Saami are themselves often very articulate and even very highly educated in the Norwegian system. But at the point that they asked you to be their advocate, was this mainly because they didn't have somebody themselves who could speak in the right idiom?
Well, the key is the right idiom. They had people. They asked me because the people who saw to it that I was asked, they themselves were articulate and were self-advocating, but they knew that they had to have an anthropologist. They knew and he wasn't by no means the most important member of the team they put together, but Norway being what it was, they felt that wouldn't be a bad addition. Mm-hmm. But if I may give you an example of the sort of dilemma that one can run into. I mentioned earlier the name of the town Tromsø, and it used to be my field base when it was just there was a museum there. Now there's a university, rather similar to my university in Canada, Memorial actually, and there is what used to be the Museum Department of Lappish Studies, actually Samiska Studia, right, which is now, and it used to be run by a curator, and it's now run by a professor, and he's retired, and so there's now this competition for this new professorship, and I've been asked to be on the committee, and very reluctantly, and you'll see why I think in a minute, I've said yes. I mean, both why reluctantly and why I've said yes. Of the 6 candidates, there are 2 that really matter. One is, if one person is the symbol of Norwegian Saami today, national Saami, it is this young man. He took a very good philosophy degree in Oslo, and his MA was on Only Bergen. But he hasn't written a line of Saami ethnography. The other candidate is a Norwegian who stumbles along, like I did, in Saami language, and wrote a good MA in anthropology. Who are you going to choose? I mean, there's going to be a compromise either way, right? So that's the reluctance. Well, why did I get myself into that? Because I was told when I was in Oslo just recently that by colleagues who backed out, you realize that in the wings of this competition there are a couple of historians, thoroughly Norwegian, and they've been writing the history of North Norway from the Norwegian point of view. And if we don't look out, because of the deadlock between these 2 characters that I mentioned, one of the historians could creep in. But it's going to be a miserable experience because I think the only way, but I would like your opinion on this, but the only way I think that I could resolve this is by saying neither of these 2, neither the young anthropologist, because he's too young, he hasn't done enough. You can't be a professor in Norway on a master's degree. I suppose you could in some subject that was well established, but it would be a very dangerous precedent to put for a young university in the north in this young politicized subject of social anthropology. And nor can you allow the fellow who is a philosopher to come in just because he's a Saami. At least that's as I see it.
Or can you allow one of the historians?
Well, that's for me. It's by first principles. No, I mean I absolutely not, because it's Saami ethnography. So my main objective there is to block the historians and then to give my reason for why neither the Saami nor the anthropologist are yet qualified for the job.
Leaving the chair vacant.
Leaving the chair vacant.
Very recently you've become interested in Israel.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, it was a quite unexpected sort of boon from ISA, from the Institute, because Don Handelman, is that a name for you? He was born in Quebec, and he's been at our institute on 2 occasions for a term or half a year each time. In fact, he co-authored one of our books on social welfare with Elliot Layton. Anyway, he simply proffered invitations to Jean and myself, and Jean went off. She managed to be away for a year, but these ISA books business don't sort of allow me to do that. So I went for 6 months, and I went in 1962. Taught a couple of courses at the Hebrew University, one with team teaching with Don, and Don saw that I was very worried about the fact, very self-conscious of the fact that I couldn't speak Hebrew, and yet I had an anthropological curiosity about Israel. He said, don't worry. And I was also worried, of course, because Jean, who'd gone first, had gone to Ulpan, to the language schools, and that's the sort of thing Jean would do, and she'd come out 1 year later, and she would be speaking Hebrew, but I'm not that sort of person. And he said, you're not, and so forget about it. Travel, move. So that's really what I did, and the Lebanese war broke out in June, and I was still there. And life hasn't been quite the same for me, and I'm very pleased about that, intellectually and emotionally too, since then. And of course I married Lisa, but people think, they put 2 and 2 together and make 5. They thought, they think I met Lisa in Israel. That's not true, actually. But she was in Israel at the time, about to become an Israeli. So what I did was to, I've been back twice, and I suppose I'll go back quite often, many times. I'm trying to devise a way in which, quite explicitly, without hiding it, I am not a Hebrew speaker, but I'm still an anthropologist in Israel. So I will take subjects and themes, that's to say, and people where I can use English. And then I will make this sort of adaptation to the traditional advice, and more than that, the sort of the hallowed canons of anthropological procedure. Namely, I can't be fly on the wall because I don't understand Hebrew.
Yeah.
And I am going to, not refrain from, but I'm going to ask leading questions. And when I say leading questions, I mean I'm going to give them my hunches. For example, I was invited back last summer to a conference, and I managed to get there a week early. And I was going back to continue my interviewing with people in the West Bank settlers. But what I ran into, everybody, I'm sure they were doing this in Hebrew and they were doing it in English because that's all my ears could take, were talking about the prisoner exchange, that last one, if you remember. So I immediately got on to the prisoner exchange business. What I'm telling you this is that it's the way that I saw how to do fieldwork in this situation. I designed a leading question, a hunch, which was Mary Douglas-like, about purity and danger. And they've got 3 of ours, so they're being polluted, and we've got 1,500 of theirs, and we don't want them because those 1,500 complete us. And so I went round and got, at great length, scholars at Bar Ilan and West Bank settlers, and an assorted number of intellectuals, of course, by definition for this sort of fieldwork, to say that's absolute rubbish, Robert, or Dr. Paine. But they told me at length why it was wrong. And the settlers are people who really need to talk. They know that they have to explain, and they know that sitting out there in the Judean desert, or down up north in around Nablus, that somehow they feel very misrepresented. They probably stop talking to each other because the pressures on them are quite considerable. Nor maybe can they talk with each other. I mean, I was going around with Lisa, Hebrew speaker, my wife, right, and with other Hebrew speakers, usually, in fact, nearly always, friends of Lisa, probably, anthropologists, MA students or junior lecturers or something, we would run in the morning to somebody who, I'm thinking of now, one particular morning went through the barbed wire into a settlement in the West Bank, and we had interviews, I suppose that's all we can call them, with a fellow who'd come out of Moscow 5 years ago, and he was sort of head of the settlement, and his assistant who'd just come from Montreal, and a couple of other people from New York, one of whom incidentally was the nephew of Cyril Silverman. I was wandering around wanting to find a urinal, and I ran into this fellow and I said, where can I have a pee? And then he said, what do you, and he told me where I could have a pee, and he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm an anthropologist. He says, well, so's my auntie. But the thing is this, okay, from Moscow, from Montreal, from New York, but they all had this one thing apparently in common, to go to the West Bank. Actually, they had very different reasons for going to the West Bank. But this is the sort of thing that I feel that we can do, and if we're Hebrew speakers, all the better. But as it happens that just as the Norwegians did not do the ethnography of the hunger strike, which I did, right, because somehow they couldn't get themselves to do that.
This is the hunger strike association.
The hunger strike in Oslo, right, and nor do the Israeli anthropologists, because they've got other things and probably other better things to do than to go into their West Bank. And anyway, they feel dirtied by it. And so in lieu of nobody else going, okay, so I go. And the thing, what I've been trying to, and it's probably I'm revealing it now, is to get over my embarrassment that at the age of 60 I'm not just about to learn Hebrew, and anyway, by the time I'd learnt it, it would all be too late. So I'm trying to devise a way of, I call it seismological anthropology. Where there is a tremor, somebody's got to get in there. And this is what we're telling our students around the Institute. And they're doing it well. I mean, NATO's moved into Labrador, low flying, and the Luftwaffe's there and the RAF. And our students are now there, and they've gone there in a sort of hurry. And it's not fly on the wall, it's going in and taking the interviews with the wing commander and so forth and so on. Of course it's incomplete, and it's a different, it couldn't stand alone. But the fact of the case is that anything that I bring back or my students bring back, respective from the West Bank or the Labrador, will go through a very elaborate filter, through the literature, through my colleagues at the Hebrew University, right? And through for the students, in the case of the students from Labrador, through the filter of colleagues at Memorial. But at least we are doing a bit of seismology.
And the resulting perspective or analysis you would call metapolitics?
Well, no, that's the thing that I feel that one of the keys to understanding Israel today is that they have, after, is it 4 millennia, have had 32 years, that was when I was there, it's now 35 years of nation statehood. And what they've done with paper, with scissors and Scotch tape, they've cut out the Goyim's history and put Abraham and Bergen together in one story. And it is not history in the sense of a narrative with something new round the corner. Everything has been said. Everything has happened. You only give the tablets to the people once, when Moses came down from the mountain, right? The Holocaust doesn't faze them at all. I mean, they've got the answer to that. It's because we did something wrong, right? And it was foretold. So this is meta history, right? And it's memory, not history. And there's nothing new. Now this has been played around by some very interesting Jewish scholars who write in English, and they're either at the Hebrew University in Jewish. I simply did an anthropological translation and said this is totemic time. It's time on a spot. And I fell into this because while I was out there, Bergen put on a big show of reburying Bar Kokhba's bones in the Judean desert. Bar Kokhba was the bloke who was the last patriot against the Romans. And he ran a sort of guerrilla band in the Judean desert, and then the Romans dealt with him eventually, but it took several legions and several years to do so. Okay, so Bergen, knowing the high prestige in which Israeli archaeology is held in the world, and with the Dead Sea Scrolls man, I forget it, Yadin is his name, isn't it? Something like that. Yeah, Yigal Yadin or somebody. He thought he could do this one. Bergen thought he could do good political capital. And so my point is not just that he was doing good political capital, but he was intellectually doing exactly what one would expect an Israeli politician to do. He was doing this meta-history. He was reburying Bar Kokhba's bones. And he had a state funeral, right? Mm-hmm. And helicopters flying out. And he had the president of the country and his cabinet out there. The fellow who wouldn't go was this archaeologist that we're calling Yadin, the Dead Sea Scrollman. He said, and how do I know that those bones belong to Bar Kokhba? Which was sacrilege. Mm-hmm. But that was the historical comment. And of course, it was not allowed in Israeli politics. So that's the sort of thing that I think can be developed.
And that's what you call inventing facts.
No, inventing facts belongs to this, but that's not exactly inventing facts. Inventing facts is much better illustrated by the tactics that they had for occupying Palestine before the West Bank against during the British Mandate. You would invent a fact overnight because the British were still abiding by Turkish law, which, this is approximately correct, that if you can manage to put a roof over your building between sunset and sunrise, it's yours. And that's the paradigm of inventing a fact. But it has become it's for the intellectuals, it's become a theme that we spot what's going on in Israelis' minds. You do invent facts. And of course Ben Gurion said, stop listening to the Goyim, invent facts. Get on with it, don't listen.
That was his explicit phrase, was it?
I would have to go back on that actually, I'm not sure. But he says, the first part, do not listen to the Goyim, go and do things. But I've heard the notion invent facts, I mean the phrase invent facts, quite often.
Mm-hmm. Said quite openly, said by the people who are in favour of doing this, or said as criticism?
Not in criticism, well, we better invent some facts here.
Fill a vacuum.
In other words, they know that they have to take some measures that would not be accepted by a sort of establishment morality, which they see as a function. You can only have establishment morality when you're nicely cosseted in your nation state. And what with all those Arabs around and so forth and so on, you can't do that. So you have to invent facts, and you have to preempt.
Yes.
But that's getting on a very political side. What is far more interesting for me is the way, in fact, they are playing with notions of time. And this is one of the reasons I went to the West Bank. The pragmatic reason is because I can use English on the West Bank. But the other reason is that the West Bankers par excellence are playing with time. They're saying it's not lineal, right? It's we are back here, and we knew we knew we would be. It's been written that we'd come back here, and it's exactly this spot where our forefathers were, and all we're doing is fulfilling the prophecy. There's nothing new here. It was all said that we would come back. And also we know that if we allow our politicians to abandon the West Bank, we know what's going to happen, because that's been prophesied, and there will be punishment.
Could you visualize any situation in which you might be drawn into some kind of advocacy in the Israeli context?
Emotionally, yes. I for some part of me, I don't know what it is, I'm thrilled by them, by the hubris, by the chutzpah of the whole undertaking. But I certainly would hope that I would like to avoid becoming an advocate there. Yeah.
Going back, we've reached the present now, but going back a long, long way to the late 40s and back to Oxford.
Ah, yes.
Probably a lot of people would be interested in hearing more about the characters of the people who are around then.
Yeah, I'm not the raconteur for that period, but Franz Steiner was, I think, of all of the people that I had most affection for, and he was very generous with his time. He wrote me a letter from Cadiz a few weeks, I think, before he died, urging me on, with my laps as they were then. He wrote this on the beach. He was very close to Evans Pritchard, and Evans Pritchard himself, I think, was very caring for him. And I believe that it's probably one of the links was that they both were sort of closet poets, and they were very private people, both of them. I mean, EP, of course, was, he thrilled people with his EP-isms in the pub, but there was a very gentle and private, almost shy side to EP, which I think resonated in the relationship between him and Franz Steiner. But it was a galaxy of people there. Dumont I liked. He was obviously the foreigner, and just a wretched diploma student. Dumont was very concerned as a guest not to upset the diploma student, and he'd smoke his Gauloise cigarettes, and I would take one and cough, and he'd be very upset about perhaps it was my last breath or something. Srinivas, joking, and people joking at him. There was a touch of, well, I'm shocked that I'm going to say this, but there was a touch of E.M. Forster, Passage to India thing, I thought. And I may not have read Passage to India either by that time, so it may in fact have been a feeling that I had independent of reading Passage to India. But there seemed to me to be this sort of flavour of the joking that was going on between Srinivas and the others there. Although
was this a role he played up to, do you think?
Well, he played up to it, yes. I mean, he had to respond. But he was loved. He really was. And his Korgs, if that's the pronunciation, his book was sort of mentioned in almost hushed tones. It was wonderful. I mean, it was aesthetic. It was beautiful. Then we had the bustling Americans. There was Dusty, Laura, and Jim hogged the third program. And I remember mutterings in the Lamb of Flag from, well, I won't say from whom, but from the Brits. That, my God, I mean, there's no end to Jim. I mean, he's always on the third. Sooner, well, you know who's saying this, right? You can but turn on your radio and you hear Jim Bohannon. But Jim, everybody respected everybody else. That was my feeling. It was a happy place. The only people we disparaged were the visitors who'd come up, these sort of provincials like Raymond Firth, who would come up and have the temerity to talk about religion in Evans Pritchard's institute. We were almost brainwashed the week before not to listen to him properly.
So somebody like Evans Pritchard remained with you for a long time.
Oh yeah. He was avuncular. He was so sweet, and he could bestow honour upon you without making you feel a creep or a client. So the honour was, "Oh, Robert, would you like to come and walk around the parks?" So I'd sit off with the great man and walk around the parks, and I was always puzzled: do I talk or do I keep silent? No, he was a very gentle man, I thought.
And so his responses, as you said earlier,
Mm.
what he would have thought about you in a certain situation,
Mm.
was something you continued to think for many years.
Yeah. Sure.